Hello and welcome to another update. In this one, I'll be covering the updates over the past week from the 3rd of June all through today. And we see that there has been a lot of changes, the start of the offensive and a lot of territorial changes within the front line, especially in the Donetsk region. So starting out to the north of Avdiivka, the Russian forces managed to advance here to the northwest of the railways, and the Ukrainian forces managed to capture this part here to the northwest of Krasnoarivka. So they were attacking each their own direction, where the Ukrainians were attempting to free up the railways in and out of Avdiivka, and the Russian forces were trying to solidify their attacks to the northeast of these railways to prevent supply through it. Then we move on to the Marinka area, where the Russian forces continued attacking both the northern outskirts and the central parts of Marinka, where they attempted to gain further control over the city. However, after just capturing a few blocks, that's all they managed, and they haven't attacked since. After which we saw some photos of the Ukrainian forces posing with their Leopard tanks, indicating the upcoming offensive was very close. And we had a lot of photos and videos of Russian supplies reaching the front line, both artillery, tanks, armored vehicles, transport vehicles, and so on. All of these arriving to the front line through these videos and photos popping up on screen right now. All of these things happened while the Russian forces were preparing for this upcoming Ukrainian offensive. So they have sent a lot of things to the front line. And that is when we started seeing attacks. The very first attacks was happening by the south of Velika Novosilka in the direction of Novo-Donetsk, as well as in the direction of Neskushne. After that, we saw a further advances by the Ukrainian forces, where they started attacking in the direction of Novo-Donetske, Rivnopil, and Neskushne, while continuing the attacks here towards Novo-Donetsk. So they started heavily attacking the Velika Novosilka area. After this, we started seeing some videos and photos of destroyed Ukrainian vehicles, as well as drone footage where the Ukrainians tried advancing and were hit by either minefields, artillery strikes, airstrikes, helicopter ambushes, and so on, which prevented them from achieving much success here on this part of the front line. However, after sending a couple of waves with a lot of companies and battalions towards the direction of the Velika Novosilka and mainly focusing around Novo-Donetsk, they managed to capture the village of Novo-Donetsk. After this, we saw that the Russian forces continued attacking, recapturing the positions, and they managed to recapture the village of Novo-Donetsk as well as the surrounding areas here on these days. So the 5th of June, we saw the Ukrainians attacking Novo-Donetsk, capturing the outskirts of it. On the 6th of June, they captured the village of Novo-Donetsk. On the 7th of June, the Russian forces recaptured Novo-Donetsk. And on the 8th of June, they managed to recapture the fields here to the northwest of Novo-Donetsk. So there was a lot of fighting back and forth happening here. But the only village on the front line that the Ukrainians managed to take here on the whole Velika Novosilka front, the Russians managed to capture just after 24 hours. After this, we also see a combination of attacks. While the attacks here by Velika Novosilka continued, the Ukrainians also started attacking by Orihov, where they attacked in the direction of Lobkove, Nesteryanka, Robotyne, and Novopokrovka, as they tried to advance in this part of the front line. And this is the main part, as it is in the direction of Tokmak, which is the village that determines whether or not the Ukrainian forces will be able to launch attacks against Melitopol and succeed in cutting off the land bridge between Russia and Crimea. So this part was significantly heavier fortified, as well as the Ukrainians sending significantly better forces, as we've seen videos and pictures of Leopard tanks, especially Leopard 2A6 variants, attack here on this part of the front line. And this is where we saw a lot more lost vehicles by the Ukrainian forces, as there are these pictures and photos of the Ukrainian forces losing upwards of 2 Leopard tanks, Leopard 2A6, and over 10 Bradleys, infantry fighting vehicles. So the very best equipment that the Ukrainians had available in this part of the front line were used here to break through the Russian defensive positions. However, all they managed to achieve is capture these fields. The Leopard's tanks specifically were destroyed somewhere around here to southwest of Novopokrovka, and fighting continued here by the road as the Ukrainian forces tried to advance by here to cut off the Russian positions here to the northeast and further achieve the flanks, protect the flanks to the main push going south towards Robotyne, moving towards Tokmak. So the Ukrainian forces here managed to capture the village of Lobkove, but again the Russian forces managed to recapture it within 24 hours, allowing them to continuously push back the Ukrainian advances, and the Ukrainians were unable to gain further success on the Orikhiv front. Then we also saw a bunch of fighting here by Bakhmut, where the Ukrainian forces managed to capture parts here to the south of Berhivka. They first actually managed to enter the village of Berhivka, but then they were pushed back by Russian forces, but then they solidified their controls over this river line, as well as forest patches here to the southwest of Berhivka, and now fighting continues here to the south of the village. As for the canal line, the Russian forces were pushed beyond the canal, losing their bridgehead, and the Ukrainians managed to capture these parts west of Gordiomivka, leaving only one singular bridgehead across the canal line for the Russian forces. So there's been a lot of fighting. The Ukrainians have been on the offensive, while the Russians only managed to advance in a singular part of the front line. The Ukrainians have been pushing across the whole front line, specifically around the south, but also around Bakhmut. And throughout all of this fighting, we have seen little to no success on the Ukrainian side so far. But that doesn't mean that the offensive is over. This is only 6 days into the offensive, and so far what we've seen is that although the Ukrainians have been unable to advance, the Russian forces are using a lot of supplies to hold back these advances, and we have only seen a slight margin of what the Ukrainians have available. We say that the Ukrainians have lost 2 Leopard 2A6, they have 14, and they have over 100 Leopard 2s, and they have over 200 Leopard 1s, and we have barely seen any of those. They may have lost 10 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, but they have hundreds of those as well. So generally, although the Ukrainian losses are significant, this is just a small margin of what they have available, so the main push is yet to come. However, we are seeing now that the Russian forces actually have a very significant development since the past advances, and that is that compared to then, the Russians now have all the necessary manpower, the necessary equipment, proper supply lines, and all of these things that the Ukrainians had of advantages the last time, they have negated this time, which allows the Russians to be able to actually defend. And something else to notice as well is that the Ukrainians have yet to actually reach the first line of defense of the Russian forces. The first line of defense is located somewhere around a 10 to 20 kilometer depth from behind the point of contact, which means that the Ukrainian forces, although they are attacking on the front line, the point of contact, they are hardly meeting any resistance. Most of the casualties are taken by either minefields, artillery strikes, airstrikes, and anti-tank gun missiles, and hardly any direct confrontation between the Russian forces. The only areas with direct confrontation are the areas where the Ukrainians captured a few villages, and then the Russian forces recaptured them by pushing back. So this is actually happening because the Russian forces have a pool of units behind the first line of defense, and whenever the Ukrainians do a push, the Russians are able to focus those forces where they want to focus them. Essentially, they are defeating the Ukrainian forces one at a time, and then they move on to the next one. So that is the current situation on the front line. The Ukrainian forces continue attacking across the whole front line, while the Russian forces attempt to re-attack, counterattack, and to regain the positions that the Ukrainians took from them. And that is a summary of the offensive so far and a summary of the past 6 days of fighting. Then we have some very interesting news, which is that a Polish general, Skiersiak, I don't know how to pronounce the Polish names, essentially what he says before a NATO summit in Vilnius, which is in Lithuania. This is scheduled to be next week. He says that the Ukrainians are not able to win unless the NATO security guarantees for Ukraine takes effect. And what does he mean by NATO security guarantees? He means 2-step process. The first one is to close the airspace over Ukraine, and the second one is to ensure security in the Black Sea. So essentially, he's saying NATO should put their navy in the Black Sea, and that they should send their planes into Ukraine to prevent the Russian forces from using their navy and their air force, which would even out the air superiority, because the main issue of the Ukrainian forces so far in this offensive is that they're unable to contest the airspace. The Russians are just launching airstrike after airstrike, helicopter after helicopter, ambushing the Ukrainian forces, and they are just having an easy time completely controlling the airspace. If the NATO forces sent their own jets with their own pilots into Ukraine to uphold the airspace, prevent the Russians from having air superiority, then the Ukrainians will be able to launch a much more successful offensive. However, this is very risky because that would mean NATO soldiers fighting Russian soldiers. So how would Russia react to that? That is a huge question, because if this ends up being the thing that determines whether or not the Ukrainian offensive will launch would be successful, then we may see the use of tactical nukes to prevent the Russian defeat here in this part of the front line, because Crimea is very important for the Russians. If they lose Crimea, they could essentially just forget about being a geopolitical player, as it is the most important warm sea port, as well as the defense of the heartland of Russia. If the West takes control over the Crimea, then the Russians will be vulnerable when it comes to Rostov and the whole southern parts of the country, which would allow them to, in case of war, have an easy advantage here. And the Russians are very paranoid when it comes to conflict, because they imagine, what if we need an army? What if we go into conflict? Then we would need the best possible situation. If they do not have Crimea and they reach a point where there is conflict, then they would lose that conflict, purely based on that. So that is a risk they aren't willing to take, and that is a general understanding within the Russian elite, the Russian government, and so on. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.